can you explain why there are competing schools and how for you how you consider these different schools? Like, do you consider them as both subjective and one has better arguments, or do you think does one take you more towards the truth?
Let's be careful about using the word truth.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that the approach of Austrian economics is to try to be more careful to, the Keynesian economics is really like what most people think of as economics. And I think what Austrian economics tries to do is take a step back and say, wait a second. And it's almost a retrospective. So for me, it's not like one school or the other. In my study of Austrian economics, which I'm not an expert or whatever, what it's gotten me to do is to use logic about the world versus like, as you said, you learned in school, here's some Keynesian principle, learn this, right? Or learn this Laffer curve and these, these rules and laws. And I think what Austrian economics tries to teach you is to use logic yourself to derive things about the world, to understand how, maybe what, again, like I said, the things that we aren't seeing, right? And I think the part of this book that actually stuck with me is actually kind of a takedown of Keynesian economics. And it's right near the beginning of the book. He says that many economists, they fail to see the big picture because, a quote, because of an intricate network of logical fallacies that mutually support themselves. So, I mean, I'd love to break that down if we can.
We can break that down. Let's go for it.
Let's first start with what a logical fallacy is. Probably a lot of people know, but really simply, it's the idea that you use logic to come to the wrong conclusion. And because you are using logic, you think you came to the right conclusion. So one example that's given is you wake up in the morning and you look outside and everything's wet. And you're like, well, it must have rained. Raining is the only thing that could have made everything wet. But we're here in the city. What if a fire hydrant exploded and literally sprayed everything? So here we came to the wrong conclusion. We used logic to come to it, but we came to the wrong conclusion. So, I mean, what Henry Hazlitt argues in this book, Economics in One Lesson, is that essentially there's this network of logical fallacies that mutually support each other and obscure the truth. So that's kind of the takedown of Keynesian economists. And he goes through lots of different examples of how they might do that. And it's worse because they all compound on each other.
And have these logical fallacies been built up and maintained their position in Keynesian economics as mainstream economics because of incentives?
Yes, absolutely. That's part of it. But it's also just a logical trap, right? You can kind of almost understand how you'd come to that conclusion that everything was wet, it must have rained. So it's yes, the incentives make it worse, but I'm saying it's also easy to make these mistakes.
Okay, and before we get into some examples of that, are there any things that Keynesian and Austrians agree on?
I don't know if I've studied this stuff well enough to say that. I mean, they agree that supply and demand is kind of a fundamental law. I think that they're two sides of the same coin. They're connected intrinsically, right?
Okay, and why do you think Austrian economics has failed to be anything more than a niche school of economics mainly appreciated by libertarians?
That's a better question. And I think that is due more to incentives. There was a passage in the book, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but it was something along the lines of that, economists, when let's say there's a special interest group of some kind that wants to institute some kind of policy, and it'll benefit them, right? Let's say they'll get government funding for this, their group, right? It could be literally an industry or whatever, and because they can, maybe petition the government or lobby the government to get this thing passed, they employ all these experts and Keynesian economists to support their position, and they start outlining some policy and why they think it should be done and why it's better for society. And he comes with the idea that there's some writer, some journalist or whatever would see this and say, that's so laughably bad, I won't even respond to it. But they employ these people for years because the payoff of getting this policy enacted is so powerful that by the time the argument has now come and it's getting close to actually being passed, the writer now comes to respond to it, and he can't even keep up with all the arguments and charts and graphs that they've drawn. So yeah, I do think it's kind of an incentives problem.
Do you think if we tried to map a school of economics to how we operate as individuals within our home, how we tend to manage our own kind of finances and bank balances, do you think we're all, because we tend to use logic, and I've brought up a couple of times, the recent example is that we've been talking a lot about government overspending, especially in the UK. This is highly relevant because I'm based there, and after making the show with Dan Tarby, highlighted that the government spends 120 billion a year on debt interest, and currently the national debt's increasing by 100 billion a year. So we're becoming kind of like increasingly aware of debt. But I always say, like, if I had access to a money printer in my bedroom at home, and I could, keep printing money to buy whatever I want, my Lambo, my house, whatever I wanted to go and get, and no one would know, but it would have this kind of like microscopic marginal effect on everyone else. Would I use it? And like, I could see times when I'd use it, right? I don't have that at home. I have to operate with a correct economic model for my family. I have to balance the books. I have to be able to pay my mortgage. If I take a loan, I have to be able to pay it back. Everything I do has to be logical. Do you think we're naturally Austrian economics within our home, economists in our home environment?
Yes, but I think the scale of these things matters a lot. For example, I'm actually really into communism at the scale of a family, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever heard this thing before?
Yeah,
Where it's
I'm a communist at home.
And then you get up to each level. And I think one of the problems we have in society is that government has just gotten just too big. It's just onerous, and it's like this giant beast, and you can't even like turn it off because there's too many pieces to it. And like you say, the big red button, turning that off is then catastrophic as well. And the same thing with central banking, turning that off would be like 2008/1929, and all these problems ensue. So I think the scale is really important on that discussion. But as far as like logic, I think everybody uses logic, right? It's the tough thing is to not only just avoid these logical traps, these logical fallacies, but to do the work to consider all of the consequences of our actions. And that's one of the things that Henry gets to in the book a lot as Hazlitt. He says that that the world is full of all of these so-called economists who in turn are full of schemes for getting something for nothing. And it's the idea that like we'll enact this one policy, but then there's all these like kind of butterfly effects down the line that like in order to use all the logic to trace all of the effects of these one policy, that's just too much work. And that's boring anyway. I'd rather be, a rhetorical politician and say, I can do this one thing and it's going to save this one group. And that group is like, yay, awesome. And then we kind of forget about all the other groups and how it affects them.
Because we don't fully understand or appreciate the cause and effect.
Absolutely.
And because also the people are making these decisions, the people in government, and by the way, I'm becoming more and more anti-government. I'm still pro-democracy. I'm anti the current state of democracy. And what's become a lot more obvious now is the incentive structure within government right now is that it's designed in such a way that they don't really suffer the consequences of the decisions they make. They're incentivized to retain power and I watched this great series on YouTube recently about bonds being the biggest scam. And then essentially all we do is from election to election, we go from one party to another, promising things which they can't afford and can't pay for. Because if they were going to make the correct promises, they'd be saying, well, we need to cut spend. We're going to have to, like in the UK, we should cut the NHS and we should cut social security. Nobody's going to vote for that party. Right. So we continue to vote for the death spiral. That's what we vote for. And I think that is the problem, is that the people who are making this decision with government aren't bound by the consequences of the things they do. Absolutely.
And, I one of the things, like the term I came up with after reading books like Henry Hazlitt's is the idea of whack-a-mole policy making, where you make one policy and it's for the same reasons we outlined, it affects some other group somewhere else, and then you have to make another policy. So like in the 1930s, they were trying to like save the farmers, and they did all these things to farms and prices and like subsidies, and it caused all these other problems that like, oh, now they had to like change the prices of industrial chemicals to keep the farmers afloat, and then like you have these tariffs happen. So like, oh, we have to do tariffs on the industrial chemicals, and then that causes other countries to like retaliate with other tariffs, and it's like it creates this web of problems. So it's very difficult to, you know, it's not like everything's a zero-sum game, but it is kind of a way that everything affects everything in the economy. And when you take from somewhere else, when you give to somebody, you're kind of taking from somewhere else, and we don't always consider those other things. And it's funny, as you mentioned, like that you're kind of getting more anti-government. And yet, like I know you say sometimes on the podcast that you're like a reluctant statist. Well, believe it or not, Henry Hazlitt, like while he makes a lot of arguments against what governments do, and he shows a lot of like kind of mistakes that, you know, governments and policymakers make, he actually himself was not like a hardcore anarcho-capitalist. And in the book, he says like having a minimum level of government. So like maybe Stephan Livera wouldn't be very happy with this guy, but I think that's fine. Like, I think the points that he's trying to make are so salient that I'm not even concerned with that part of the conversation of whether or not government should exist. I just think it's great to kind of examine these things and try to understand how we could, you know, what really are the problems with the world? Because I think a lot of it comes down to these policy decisions and these butterfly effects.
Yeah, I mean, the reluctant statist position comes from that. Pretty much every part of the world that doesn't have democracy has tyranny.
Yeah.
And so that's not to say we can't improve on democracy, but it's not wanting to slip into tyranny. And it's having that ability that I can go down to Downing Street, where Parliament is, and I can hold up a sign saying our Prime Minister is a fraud, or our Prime Minister, you know, like any combination of insulting words. I can protest outside government. I have free speech with certain limitations, which we're aware of because I have a lawsuit, but like we have that, and you have that essentially here in the US. I believe it's always under attack. I mean, it's under attack in the UK at the moment. The right to protest is always under attack, but we have that. And so that's my position, but that's not to say that democracy is not fragile right now. But yes, I'm becoming more. I think I've become more anti-government because I think I think democracy has been allowed to slide into benefiting the elected over the electorate, and the electorate have not retained enough control. We need to chop a few heads off.
Oh well, that's not the arguments that are made in the book, but
no.
Listen, like I am kind of more towards the spectrum where I've been trying to at least entertain the idea of what society would look like without governments. And, you know, I think like some of the arguments he makes in this book, although he's not making that argument, what is the most difficult part about this conversation to even have in the first place is to imagine what could be that isn't. And this sounds like such a simple concept. It sounds like such a simple paradigm. Just, oh, well, you're just imagining other things. But like, you know, like what would this society look like without a government is a very, like, that's really what he's imagining with like every single policy that he kind of goes through in this book. He's saying, well, what else could have been? So like the Brooklyn Bridge, we built the Brooklyn Bridge. It's this great giant, it's massive, it's beautiful. The London Bridge in London, right? Like it connects two places. That's awesome, right? But like what could society have instead? And there's also like, there's the old libertarian trope about roads, right? Like who will build the roads if we didn't have a government? And, you know, I've made the argument before. We as kids grew up watching the Jetsons and having flying cars. Well, what if because we spent all this money on roads and there's all these messed up incentives that the roads end up costing all this money. What if as a society, we could have already gotten to the point where we had flying cars today if we didn't invest so much money in all these government roads? Like that's harder to do, to make these imaginations. You need this conscious effort of the imagination to imagine what else could be.
Well, it's a bit like if you look at what's happened with NASA up until probably around 1971 or whatever the date is. But like, you know, innovation at NASA slowed down and it's been outcompeted by Elon Musk. What he's done,
Crushed it.
absolutely, because
100x cheaper, right?
Yeah, because the private's reusable rockets. The private sector's proved it.
Right.
Yeah, we got Concorde was it the 70s? We got Concorde.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and that fleet has been now retired, and we don't have supersonic air travel anymore.
Right.
We have large or efficient, what is it, 787s and A3. We've got an A380,
That one's crazy.
but the A380's been retired, so it's the A350 or so we haven't had that innovation, and something's happened with the money, which you can point to as being one of the things potentially. I mean, you say
I've done that.
in 1971. That was the first show we ever made, dude.
Yes, it
People
was.
should go and listen to that. The What the Fuck Happened in 1971. No, I agree. I mean, and I think we should save this for the end of the discussion, because I believe you will always have government. It's just what is the shape of that government. I think a great example. Are you watching The Last of Us at the moment?
Oh no, I've heard so many good things.
Zombie
though.
apocalypse.
Yeah.
And what happens in a zombie apocalypse? Groups of people end up coming together, and within that you have leaders, and you end up having some functioning form of leadership, which is essentially some form of government. I think you will always have some form of centralization, people choosing to build some form of governance for a way of groups of people to operate together.
Yeah.
So it's what do you get?
It's funny because, like, you remember when we were kind of talking about on the podcast, I say we, but like you guys are on the podcast, we're talking about like free private cities. And I think you were talking to one of these gentlemen and you were like, so there's no taxes there. And he's like, well, there's these fees that you pay. And you're like, well, isn't that like taxes?
That's a tax.
Like, yeah,
it's a fucking tax.
Isn't there somebody that's kind of in charge? So it's like, but are the incentives different? And that's the question. So, right.
Well, that's my problem with democracy at the moment. The incentive model's broken because people realize, oh, holy shit, like we can print all this money and like we don't have to deal with the consequences.
Definitely.
And that's why.
But we're still like, now we're like, oh, wait, we do have to deal with the consequences.